Governor Patrick, thank you for sharing your wisdom and insights about making democracy meaningful with us tonight. The floor is all yours.
Wow. Joe, thank you for that incredibly generous introduction and meaningful introduction. It's great to see you. I'm not surprised that you, like a number of my friends, are active with Crimson Goes Blue. And I feel like after listening to Candace and Faulkner, let alone Janet's marvelous summary, and then the lyrics of the song that the callbacks were saying, there really is nothing more to say. We could go right to the Q&A. I do want to just say how grateful I am to everybody for what you did and what you do to make our democracy personal. Your willingness to show up, to talk to people, to engage with people, I'll bet in a whole lot of cases, who might not already agree with us. But that is the work of actual citizenship. And it's reviving our citizenship, I think, that is so essential to addressing the challenges that face our democracy. I just want to say a word or two, sort of keying off the wonderful and deserved enthusiasm about the midterm results. The outcomes were indeed different than those that were forecast. And because so many election deniers and Trump impersonators lost their bids for office, Republicans seem to be reeling and Democrats seem to be relieved. I will say probably the obvious, which is that it's not time quite yet to relax, because despite the election outcomes, as important as they were, not enough has changed. If politics is still about how democratic societies mediate their differences, there's still a whole lot to worry about the state of our politics nowadays. I think there just has to be more to it than name calling and one-upsmanship, the breathless, fear-mongering emails that we all get in overabundance, and raising as much money as possible to form relationships with voters through 30-second ads in the last few weeks of the campaign. There's got to be more to talk about in campaigns than outrage. And I think what I am observing when I step back is that we have two related, but they're not the same challenges to our democracy that continue. One is to make it function. Candace touched on this. You all have experienced it. So did Faulkner, for that matter. How to make it straightforward, transparent, and reliable to register, stay registered, vote, and have that vote counted. And this first challenge is serious, of course. It's gotten deserved attention in the wake of the 19 states and counting that have moved these new voter suppression laws. That is important. But these recent measures really are just the latest in a prolonged trend toward encumbering American democracy. Other measures, as you know, include hyper-partisan gerrymandering, the widespread purging of registration rolls, the flood of money, much of it dark, into our policy making and into our politics, and the persistent and lately, sadly, successful efforts to undermine the Voting Rights Act. And if you add to that the amount of disinformation amplified by social media, you get a sense of just how much we are up against. I think the point is that for a long while now, we've been treating the functioning of our democracy the way a friend of mine describes it, as if it would tolerate limitless abuse without breaking. And whether this is all part of a grand strategy or just a series of unfortunate and dangerous coincidences, they add up to serious constraints on participation and representation that make democracy weaker. So there's important work to do here, which you all know, and in many, many ways, by engaging individuals in community. You're doing the critical work of overcoming those barriers, and there are a number of measures stuck in our Congress to try to address them. But I want to say that making our democracy function is not the only big challenge that we face. The second, in my view, is how to make our our vote, indeed our citizenship, meaningful. And I think that challenge is as insidious, if not more so, than the other, and yet we hear hardly a word about it. And I just want to say a word or two about what I mean by that. Fully a third of eligible Americans don't vote when turnout is high, like in a presidential election, not just because it's harder, but because they don't think that vote matters. They don't think it counts. Unkept promises, inauthentic candidates and uninspiring campaigns, insurmountable odds, impenetrable political establishment, change that's slow to come. And you add to that, God, it made me furious in this cycle, the prognosticators who tell us months before anyone has cast a vote what the outcome is going to be. And all of it serves, I think, to convince a lot of people, maybe some of those that you encountered, that their civic duty to vote is a waste of valuable time. And that is a serious problem. I think it has its roots because in some of what we have seen over the years, and frankly, some of what an awful lot of young people are rightly calling out, which is that democracy has not delivered on the promise of democracy for some while. It's important to elect Democrats because frankly, Democrats are the only ones talking about how to lead people forward to a better life in America. But it isn't enough to talk. We have to hold everybody accountable for delivering on the agenda in front of us. Obviously, the work we're doing to elect Democrats is a critical first step. But the weeding out of who those candidates will be and favoring those who actually are about doing the job, not just getting the job, is also an important part of citizenship. Joe made a reference to my growing up, he said, humble beginnings. I was a poor kid from the south side of Chicago who grew up on welfare. And I got my chance to serve as a civil rights and business lawyer, as an executive in 2 Fortune 50 companies, as an investor, an entrepreneur, as a 2-term governor. Now there's students who call me professor, which I resist a little bit because it rhymes in my mind with retired. But my story in many ways, perhaps like yours, is of not being defined by my circumstances of or zip code of birth. It is an American story, and while it was never told often enough in this country, it was told more often once in this country than in any other place on earth. And I think the truth is that over the last few decades, that story is lived less and less often. It's experienced less and less often. And it is not because of any lack of personal responsibility or grit. Janet, you trying to get me to stop?
I would never say that.
I see you there.
but we want to have a chance for some Q&A.
I'll just wrap up by saying it's not because people are, my grandmother used to say, hope for the best and work for it. I don't think that we have people hoping any less or working any less hard. What's happened is that we as citizens and as a society have failed to keep up our side of the bargain by investing in the kinds of things that make it possible for people to help themselves. In the public education, in transportation, in an economy that is growing out to everybody, not just up to the well-connected, in affordable higher education and student loans that people can afford to repay. And if you just think about the long list of policy initiatives that Democrats are working for and standing for and fighting for, they are connected to this idea of restoring the promise of democracy. And that's why I think that the work you're doing is so critical, in fact, indispensable. The next thing that has to happen is that we have to build, in addition to grassroots organizing in time for campaign, a permanent grassroots infrastructure, community building all the time, not just in time. And I hope we get a chance to talk about that. But that's a little further down on the agenda of CGB just now. I know it will be in time. Thanks a lot for everything you do. And thanks for having me tonight.
Well, thank you so much. You're so inspiring. And I think we do know that there needs to be year-round work. And actually, a lot of the money that we donated was to community groups to do that year-round work. And I've lately been thinking that, you know, when people ask for solutions to hunger, they're the sort of long-term solutions, but you also need the food banks. And we're kind of the food banks when we come in, you know, during the GOTV time, but that year-round stuff needs to happen. So folks, if you have questions for Governor Patrick, please put them in the chat. I'm going to start off with one, and then we'll open it up.
Is it okay to refer the question to Candace or Faulkner? If
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You know, when we were canvassing at that bus station in North Carolina, there were those people, just like you said, who were like, you know, I've been poor my whole life. I'm still poor, no matter who I vote for, nothing changes, whatever. And of course, you know, I personally see the Democrats as offering something much different than what the Republicans are offering. But I'm curious how you might answer that when you're talking to somebody whose real life they don't feel like they're getting there. And what do Democrats need to communicate about what we do for people and what we're trying to do for the country?
So the first thing I want to say, and I should have said at the outset what is maybe obvious, but I want to say as a matter of record, I'm no expert here. I'm a relative amateur. I've run for 2 offices successfully and 1 for 15 minutes, not so successfully. But so I think my perspective is still formed as a citizen rather than a, you know, political operative or expert. But I'll give an example of where I think we may be. In 2020, through an organization I worked with, we invested time in 80 counties in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, where folks had voted once or twice for Obama in the majority, and then in 2016 for Trump. And rather than shame them for their vote with Trump, a year before we had a nominee, we just engaged them on how they were thinking about politics. And then ultimately, you know, after several months, how they were thinking about Democrats. And once we had a nominee, how they were thinking about Joe Biden. And we did a number of short ads, none of them scripted, all in the voices of the people we were talking with, you know, recorded on a smartphone, about why it is they were willing to vote and going to vote for Democrats or vote for Biden. And what they talked about was not messaging. It was about being seen and heard. It wasn't about agreeing with all of our agenda. It was the power of showing up and listening to what it is they were worried about. And if you listen to enough accounts of that, even what are described as the grievances of white working people and rural people, you know, the economic insecurity, the social isolation, the despair as measured by things like suicide rates and addiction rates, they are the exact same things that Black and brown people in cities have been worrying about and hurting over for generations. And the notion that we would not be talking about our solutions as solutions that themselves are bridges to greater unity, that we all have a stake in the vision we bring and the solutions we're putting forward, and connecting them up to that vision is a shortcoming, I think, that I feel sometimes we as Democrats miss. It's not a horse race. It really isn't, I don't believe. I think it is about a destination that we are driving to. And the fact that we might not get there in a term or 2 is less important. I think progress is important, but is less important than actually trying to describe something and persuade people that we're for something that is about everybody.
Thank you. I think we have some questions. Lisa, do you want to throw one out?
Yes. Hi, Governor Patrick, thank you. I already have a vision of bringing you back for just a conversation with this group, but there are quite a few questions about the Democratic Party. So I'll share a few and you choose the one that you feel most impassioned to talk about. One, why isn't the Democratic Party, or how can we help them build more deep infrastructure versus kind of jumping in all the time? Two, how do we help get more dark money out of politics? It's kind of an arms race. Is there work that we could do in the leadership level of the Democrats? And or three, how do we build more of a pipeline that's kind of starts at the grassroots to create candidates? So choose your topic that you feel most excited to address.
So let me try the first and the second together, Lisa. In 2018, in the midterms, I remember I was working on a bunch of congressional races, all in the places where the, sort of out of the way of the big media markets. So I was doing stuff in Texas and in Mississippi, for example, and in Alabama. And what I found in all those places is that there were already grassroots groups working, community groups working in loose coalition statewide, and in every case outside of the state party. And in most of those cases, because as they said to me, the state party wouldn't let them in. We have to acknowledge we have a pretty tight and hard to penetrate party apparatus in a lot of places. And so I think if that is indicative of a broader perception, it might not be the right thing for the national party to take the responsibility at the outset of being the source of a permanent grassroots network. But I do think Howard Dean was right. I think he was right. A 50-state strategy is essential. You cannot show up in a place where Democrats don't often run, in a place that is always described by itself and others as red, and support a Democratic candidate when the only thing they've been hearing about Democrats is what Republicans tell them all the rest of the time. We have to be present. We have to engage. And so I think there are a lot of these great groups out there. There's a terrific organization called Movement Voter Project that has helped to identify a bunch of those organizations. We founded one called Bridge Together. I think we got to be looking for those kinds of partnerships first. And related to that, to let the grassroots tell us what the agenda and the messaging ought to be, to listen for that, and not just come in and say, here are the talking points we want you to pass around to everybody else. As I say, I think there was real power in it, and I think there's a lot to learn from it.
I think we have time for one more quick question.
Yeah. What do you think should be our role in the Deep South, which is 30% Black? Should we be focusing more on that? And if so, how?
So I mean, consistent with the point I was making about the importance of a 50-state strategy, yes, we should. I think we should also quit presuming and counting votes without asking for them, and that which is a Democratic habit, I'm sorry to say. And that means don't presume that Black people or brown people or women in suburbs or whatever it is will vote Democratic because they happen to be in that group. Folks know when you are taking them for granted. They know it. And the Republican talking point has been just that, right? Alongside the misinformation and the rest of it. It has been just that. They count your vote without asking for it. Why don't you give us a try? And so I've never believed demographics for destiny. I've never believed that. But I think showing up, being present, listening, letting folks at the grassroots tell you how to organize and what to organize around is the way you build political power. And I think that's exactly what the party used to, that was our brand. And I think in some ways we have to go back to it and modernize it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this conversation. And we would love to have you back. I